Something changes before anything actually changes. Before the arguments start. Before the distance becomes obvious. Before anyone says a single word out loud, something quiet, almost invisible, begins to shift. And most people miss it entirely. Not because they're not paying attention, but because the human mind is wired to protect itself from truths it isn't ready to face. We see what we want to see. We ignore what threatens the life we've built. But emotional affairs don't begin dramatically. They don't start with a decision. They begin in the small moments: a message that arrives late at night, a smile that someone can't quite explain, a conversation that felt different from all the others. And by the time most people notice something is wrong, the emotional foundation of the relationship has already quietly shifted beneath their feet. This isn't a story about betrayal. This is a story about human psychology, about why people hide emotional connections, how those patterns develop in silence, and what the behavioral science actually tells us about the way people protect secret emotional worlds. Stay with this, because somewhere in what follows you may recognize something you've already lived through. We live in a culture that understands physical affairs. There's a script for it: the anger, the heartbreak, the clear definition of what was violated. But emotional affairs are different. They exist in a space where nothing technically happened, and yet everything has already changed. An emotional affair is not simply a friendship. It is a deep, sustained emotional investment in another person that is deliberately kept hidden from a primary partner. It involves the exchange of intimacy, not physical but psychological. The kind of intimacy that is supposed to be protected inside a relationship. What makes emotional affairs psychologically complex is that they thrive in ambiguity. The person engaging in one can convince themselves, sometimes genuinely, that they haven't done anything wrong, that it's just a friendship, that they're just talking, that nothing has happened. But the secrecy tells a different story. Because if it were truly innocent, there would be nothing to hide. The secrecy is the signal. The concealment is the evidence. And the psychology of why people conceal emotional connections, even from themselves, is one of the most fascinating and painful patterns in modern relationship behavior. To understand it, we have to start at the very beginning, not at the moment of discovery, but at the moment when the very first wall quietly went up. The first thing that changes is not behavior, it's attention. Before the phone habits shift, before the late nights, before the subtle withdrawal, a person's internal attention begins to move, quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a compass needle that starts to drift before anyone looks at it. They begin to think about someone in a way that has weight, not the casual thinking about a colleague or a friend, but a specific recurring return to one person's words, opinions, reactions. What would they think of this? What would they say? This stage is rarely recognized as significant because it feels harmless. Thoughts, after all, are private. But this is where the emotional investment begins. Stage 1. The emotional anchor in most documented relationship patterns. Emotional affairs begin with a person who feels genuinely heard. Maybe communication in the primary relationship has become functional, practical discussions about bills, schedules, responsibilities. The emotional depth has quietly eroded, not through conflict but through routine. Then someone else offers something different, a real conversation, curiosity about their inner world, the experience of being truly listened to. This is neurologically powerful. The brain responds to genuine emotional attention with the same reward pathways activated by early romantic connection. It's not weakness, it's human neuroscience. And so the anchor forms. One person becomes the place where emotional energy flows more freely. Stage 2. The boundary blur here is where the psychology becomes more complex, because the person involved often doesn't recognize the shift as meaningful. They rationalize it. We're just friends who can talk about real things. But small behaviors begin to change. They start to be slightly more careful about what they mention at home. Not lying yet, just not mentioning. Selective omission. They might keep certain conversations off shared devices. Not because they've planned to, but because some part of their brain registers that what they're doing wouldn't look right in the light. The boundary between friendship and emotional intimacy has blurred, and they know it somewhere beneath the rationalizations. Stage 3. The protection of the connection. This is the stage where behavioral scientists begin to observe the clearest patterns. The person starts to protect the emotional connection. They become defensive if it's questioned. They deflect with humor, with dismissiveness, with counterattacks. You're being insecure. It's nothing. The phone habits shift here. Not dramatically at first, but screens are angled slightly differently. Notifications are turned off. Conversations are deleted not because of guilt necessarily, but because of a desire to maintain a private space. Here is the key psychological insight. The concealment is not always about shame. It's about preservation. They are protecting something that has become emotionally valuable to them. The secrecy becomes an act of protection, not just deception. Stage 4. The emotional withdrawal at home. As the outside emotional investment grows, something measurable begins to contract within the primary relationship. Emotional presence decreases. The person becomes physically present but psychologically elsewhere. Conversations that used to feel natural now feel effortful. Conflict that might have been resolved feels not worth the energy. Intimacy, emotional and often physical, begins to feel like a performance rather than a genuine expression. Partners often describe this stage as, "They were there, but they weren't really there." The person themselves often can't fully explain it. They may attribute it to stress, to work, to a phase. But what has actually happened is that their emotional reservoir, the finite resource of deep connection, is being invested somewhere else. And the relationship at home is running on what remains. This is the moment that determines everything. There comes a point, usually subtle, rarely dramatic, where the person makes a choice, consciously or not, to prioritize the protection of the external connection over the health of the primary relationship. It might look like a decision to delete a conversation rather than leave it visible. It might look like the first time they actively lie, not omit, but fabricate about where they've been or who they've talked to. This is the psychological turning point, because before this moment, the person could have stepped back. After this moment, they are in a pattern of sustained deception. The lie changes something neurologically. Research in behavioral psychology consistently shows that the first intentional lie in a relationship creates a cognitive dissonance that the brain immediately begins to resolve, not by stopping the lie, but by constructing a narrative that justifies it. They wouldn't understand. Our relationship is already broken. This isn't hurting anyone. The narrative becomes a psychological shelter. And from inside that shelter, the deception continues, not necessarily with malice, but with the deeply human need to avoid confronting the full weight of what is happening. Why does this happen? Why do people who genuinely love someone, who made commitments, who built lives together, find themselves protecting emotional secrets? The psychology is not simple, and it is rarely about one cause. Emotional starvation is one of the most commonly documented drivers. When a person's emotional needs validation, curiosity, genuine listening, playfulness, intellectual stimulation go consistently unmet within a relationship, the brain begins to seek those resources elsewhere. This is not moral failure. It is a biological drive toward emotional sustenance. Identity erosion is another factor. Many people, particularly in long-term relationships, experience a gradual dimming of their individual identity. They become a partner, a parent, a provider, but somewhere along the way, the person they were curious, spontaneous, fully alive got quieter. An emotional connection with someone outside the relationship can feel like a rediscovery of that self. And that feeling is extraordinarily powerful. Avoidance psychology plays a crucial role as well. Addressing real problems in a primary relationship is emotionally expensive. It requires vulnerability, difficult conversations, the risk of rejection from someone whose opinion matters more than almost anyone else's. An outside emotional connection provides the benefits of intimacy without the cost of that vulnerability. It is, in psychological terms, a low-risk, high-reward emotional transaction, and the human brain is drawn to exactly that. What most people misunderstand about emotional affairs is that they are rarely about the other person. They are almost always about something missing, something lost, something longed for within the person who is hiding. The person they are connecting with is in many cases simply the location where their unmet emotional needs found an outlet. This does not excuse the deception, but it does explain it. This is not a rare phenomenon. This is one of the most common and least discussed patterns in modern relationships. In an age of constant digital connection, the conditions for emotional affairs have never been more available. Smartphones create private spaces within shared lives. Social media enables the rediscovery of past connections. Messaging apps allow sustained, intimate conversations that leave no physical trace. The architecture of modern communication was not built with relationship boundaries in mind. It was built for connection, and it connects people with enormous efficiency. including in ways that partners were never meant to see. Beyond technology, there is the deeper cultural reality. We are living through a period of unprecedented emotional isolation. Despite being more connected than ever, rates of loneliness, emotional disconnection, and relationship dissatisfaction continue to rise globally. People are hungry for depth, for conversations that go beyond logistics, for the experience of being truly known by another person. And when that hunger exists within a relationship that has grown routine, when emotional novelty has given way to predictability, when vulnerability has been replaced by habit, the conditions for emotional seeking are fully in place. This is a human story, not a story about bad people, but about people living with unmet needs in a world that makes it easier than ever to seek them elsewhere quietly, invisibly, one message at a time. Here is the question that matters most, not academically, but personally. How many people are inside a relationship right now, sensing that something is different but unable to name what has changed? How many have noticed the small shifts in phone habits, in emotional presence, in the quality of conversations, and chosen to rationalize rather than confront? And how many reading this are recognizing something not in their partner but in themselves? Because emotional withdrawal is not always the result of an outside connection. Sometimes people disappear emotionally from a relationship without another person being involved at all. The pattern of concealment, of keeping an inner emotional world separate from a partner, can develop for many reasons. What this psychology asks us to consider is simple but uncomfortable. Are we truly present in our relationships? Are we bringing our real emotional selves to the people we've chosen? Or are we, in some quiet way, somewhere else? The most painful discoveries in relationships are rarely about dramatic betrayals. They are about slowly realizing that two people who were once genuinely close have been living separate inner lives, and that somewhere along the way, the closeness stopped being shared. Recognizing the behavioral patterns of emotional concealment is not about suspicion. It is about awareness, about understanding how emotional distance develops, why people hide connection, and what the early signals of psychological withdrawal actually look like. Because the earlier these patterns are understood, the more possible it becomes to address what's actually happening rather than what's only being shown. At what point does emotional distance actually begin? Is it in the first hidden conversation? Or long before that, in the silence between two people who stopped asking real questions? And do people leave relationships suddenly, or do they slowly, quietly, emotionally disappear long before they ever say they're going? Emotional affairs don't begin with betrayal. They begin with a need that went unspoken, a distance that went unaddressed, and a connection that filled a silence the relationship had stopped trying to break. The secrecy is not always born from cruelty. Sometimes it is born from hunger, from loneliness that exists inside a relationship, from the deeply human need to feel known. Understanding this doesn't make the hiding right. It doesn't dissolve the damage that concealment causes to partners, to trust, to the slow erosion of a shared emotional life. But it does make the pattern human. And in understanding it honestly, clearly, without looking away, there is the possibility of something more important than judgment. There is the possibility of real emotional honesty with a partner, with ourselves. Because the most powerful thing two people can do in a relationship is not to search for signs of distance, but to close that distance before it ever needs to be hidden.